Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry Hauptman. I come from the Conflict Management Program here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here this afternoon for this important forum sponsored by the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights. And this is the second of the Lantos Rule of Law lectures that we've been able to sponsor here at SAIS, and we hope it will be the beginning, indeed, the continuation, rather, of a long series of relationships between our programs here at SAIS and the Lantos Foundation. The foundation, of course, is named in honor of the former Congressman Tom Lantos from California, who was a very active human rights advocate and many other things, but in particular, he's known for his work in human rights during his many years in Congress. And therefore, we're very, very pleased to have this particular program here at SAIS, and we're pleased that the Lantos Foundation chose to come to SAIS for this program. So I'm pleased to introduce the director of the Lantos Foundation, Katrina Lantos-Tvedt, the daughter of the congressman, and she will introduce our panel for this afternoon. So again, welcome everyone, and Katrina, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking Professor Hauptman and SAIS for our wonderful partnership on the Lantos Rule of Law lecture, now in its second year. It felt like an urgent initiative when it was launched in 2017, and quite frankly, it feels even more urgent today as we draw to the close of 2018. This afternoon, it is my great pleasure to introduce the 2018 Lantos lecturer, Professor Harold Koh of Yale University, and the author of the very recently published book, The Trump Administration and International Law. We truly could not have a more timely speaker for this year's lecture. His resume is actually kind of embarrassing for the rest of us because it is so chock-a-block full of illustrious accomplishments, and I just have to briefly outline a few of them for you, if I may. Harold Koh is the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. He returned to Yale Law School in January 2013 after serving for nearly 4 years as the 22nd legal advisor of the U.S. Department of State. Professor Koh is one of the country's leading experts in public and private international law, national security law, and human rights. He first began teaching at Yale Law School in 1985 and served as its 15th dean from 2004 until 2009. From 2009 to 2013, he took leave to join the State Department as its legal advisor, service for which he received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award. From 1993 to 2009, he was the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. And from 1998 to 2001, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Professor Koh has received 17 honorary degrees and more than 30 awards for his human rights work. And we are really so honored that he has agreed to be here with us today to deliver the 2018 Lantos Rule of Law lecture. Above and beyond just the pride in being able to introduce someone so distinguished, for me in particular, it's a very special opportunity to introduce this remarkable individual to you. Dr. Koh knew my father well, and the two of them had a relationship that went beyond the merely cordial and professional to a deeper and warmer level. I was able to witness their friendship firsthand on several occasions. And my father often told me that of the many extraordinarily impressive people he had the chance to know in his work, Professor Koh was one of the rare people who was as good as he was smart. I think the admiration was mutual. And if I'm not mistaken, on one occasion when Professor Koh, I think in the capacity as Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Rights, and Labor, was testifying before my father, he said that testifying about human rights before Tom Lantos was a little bit like talking about flood abatement in front of Noah. It was exciting, but a little intimidating. Professor Koh, we are eagerly looking forward to your remarks today. The Lantos Foundation established this lecture based on our conviction, borne out by historical experience, that human rights can only be sustained and advanced if they are built on a robust architecture of law, both international and domestic. That law, in turn, as you so brilliantly elucidate, is ultimately upheld not primarily by coercion, but by norm internalization and the resulting patterns of obedience. There can be no doubt we are living in a time when powerful leaders, both at home and abroad, are seeking to undermine the consensus and compliance with a broad array of international human rights standards. And this is gravely undermining support for the rule of law in ways that are both subtle and blaring. We are eagerly looking forward to your remarks today in hopes of better understanding how we can sustain the imperfect but very important international architecture of law in a time of really unprecedented challenge. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Harold Koh.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for being here today. It's a great honor to be here both at SAIS and also in the company of the Lantos Foundation. Tom and Annette Lantos were extraordinary figures in human rights. I first met Tom Lantos in 1998, and we immediately launched into a long conversation about human rights, which reminded me of giving orals to a professor. Of course, he was a professor. And he had an astonishing combination of deep and detailed knowledge of both rules and process, combined with huge passion for human rights and justice, which came from his time as a Holocaust survivor, and an amazing commitment to principle, which he passed on to everyone around him. When you were with him, you couldn't help but feel that there was more to be done and that you weren't doing enough. And Annette, his constant companion, reaffirmed that this was a family endeavor. And so I've had a great honor to meet several successive generations, Katrina and her siblings. And when you look at them from one perspective, they look like Tom. When you look at them from another perspective, they look like Annette. And then their own children, one of whom is here today, who have in various fields of human rights and political and public activity made such a huge difference already at a very young age, with more to come. So it's a huge pleasure to be here, especially on this 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I should also say I'm grateful to Elliot Cohen for being willing to join me on the stage here. We were just recalling that we were in a class together at Harvard College in 1974. Elliot, that's 44 years ago. We were very young then, but we're not so young now. But since then, I've had many occasions to work with him on matters in which he's shown great principle, most recently the travel ban case, in which he signed a bipartisan brief about the lack of national security justification for the ban, and I'm very grateful to him for that principled stand. Let me say a word about the book, The Trump Administration in International Law, and how it came to be. On the day that Trump was elected, the students at Yale Law School had a school-wide meeting to talk about what to do, and they asked me to say something. And one student with tears in his eyes stood up and said, "I want America to win, but I want Donald Trump to lose. Is that possible?" And I said, yes, because Donald Trump doesn't own international law. It's bigger than Donald Trump. And they then said, well, how should we implement your commitment? And I said that we should start a rule of law clinic, which would bring a series of cases or to support litigation to sustain the rule of law in the time of Trump. That clinic at Yale Law School has worked on such issues as the travel ban, immigration generally, climate change, the census, reapportionment, Muslim anti-discrimination. We filed about 55 briefs in all. And then the other product was this book. Now, when I was asked recently, what is the thesis of your book in 3 words or less? The answer is, he's not winning. He's not winning. For all of the impression that you get of wild activity on the part of Trump and their events and actions every single day, when you put them all together, the sum is much less than the parts. Many of his actions are, in fact, multiple actions to try to achieve the same outcome, all of which turn out to be held illegal. Take, for example, immigration. Trump has launched a series of attacks on immigrants: the wall, the travel ban, 1, 2, and 3, family separation, ending temporary protected status, attacking chain migration, attacking the courts on the grounds that they're not protecting us against bad hombres, gutting the visa lottery, adopting a so-called zero-tolerance policy, ending the global compact on migration, perhaps most shockingly claiming a right to bomb on behalf of Syrian children who he will not admit to the United States. But most fundamentally, his immigration policy is shock and awe. It's to encourage self-deportation by a series of grotesque measures, one after another. Now, in fact, what has been less noticed is one after another they've been held illegal. And so, for example, his family separation policy was declared illegal by 2 judges. One judge said they would not allow children and their families to be separated for more than 20 days. As a result, he has pretty much abandoned that policy and shifted to a claim that we should do away with birthright citizenship. The problem, of course, being that the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution says that people who are born in the United States shall be citizens. So that went nowhere, although it was simply as a way of baiting red meat before the election. Now he switched to a policy where he says that you cannot apply for asylum at ports of entry, between ports of entry, even though the statute enacted says you have a right to seek asylum whether or not at a port of entry. And so already this has been held to be illegal on a temporary restraining order. When the Trump administration sought a stay at the Ninth Circuit a few days ago, it was rejected by the same judge who, as a lawyer, had written the torture opinion for the Office of Legal Counsel. So this is an astonishing state of affairs. Now, I know what you're going to say. What about the Muslim ban? It's been called the travel ban. But as Bill Clinton liked to say, it doesn't matter how much lipstick you put on that pig, it's still a pig. Still a Muslim ban. It is true that by a 5-4 vote, it was sustained at the Supreme Court, but the litigation still goes on. And all that was held was that the preliminary injunction couldn't be sustained on its face. Whether it is unconstitutional as applied, in other words, whether they're granting waivers or not, is the subject of discovery in the district courts. People cannot fly from the travel ban countries to the United States without passing through European countries, and therefore the European Court of Human Rights will still have a say on this issue. And finally, as you know, the legislature in the House side has flipped in favor of the Democrats. 40 seats have now shifted, so there will probably be legislation to counteract the travel ban. So all of this is an example of how Trump's activities are, in large part, sound and fury, signifying nothing. Take another example. The Paris Climate Agreement. With great fanfare, the Trump administration announced that we were withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Under international law, you can't withdraw or even file a request for withdrawal until November 4th, 2019, which is still a year away. Even if you do so, it won't be effective until November 4th, 2020, which is the day after the next presidential election. And if he's sued, which he will be, on the claim of whether he has the power unilaterally to withdraw from this agreement, and the courts take up the case, it could well go over into the next presidency, at which point the United States will never withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Let me give yet another example, which is North Korea. I went to North Korea. My friend Steve Schleicher is here, who worked with me at the time on East Asian affairs for the State Department. Here, we had an initial claim by Trump that he was radically changing the policy and getting rid of the policy of strategic patience, which obviously raises the question, what is our policy? Strategic impatience? But then, in a series of activities where first he threatens various kinds of nuclear attacks, he says he will end North Korea. This is a country where my mother lived. 25 million civilians, he will end them. That's obviously a war crime. He mocked Rex Tillerson, who was not a good Secretary of State, for wanting diplomacy, and now he is himself at diplomacy. In fact, he spent much of the last UN General Assembly wandering around the UN saying, I love him, I fell in love. Where is Kim Jong-un? What a radical turnaround. Now, Kim Jong-un, from his own perspective, has played this extremely well. To get leverage for the poker game to come, he built nuclear weapons. The mountain he was testing them in broke, and now he decided he could get leverage by de-escalating and saying that he would talk. But again, as a matter of law, he promised nothing. He said he would move toward denuclearization. I'm moving this toward you. I'll move it back. It's actually not a promise at all. And he violated the first rule of diplomacy, which Steve and I worked together on at the department, which is you never bring out your principal, the President of the United States, until after you've gotten concessions. If Trump wants to meet Kim Jong-un and vice versa, Kim Jong-un should make all the concessions first. And he did a standard move, which we saw frequently with the Chinese. Tom Lantos saw this all the time, which is before a big meeting, they arrest a lot of people, and then when the meeting happens, they release them. And we all knew better than to give anyone credit for that kind of transparent ruse. Instead, he said they released them because of me, when in fact they also arrested them because of him. You would have expected, and now Mike Pompeo would like to meet with the North Koreans. Why would they meet with him when they could meet with Trump himself? And the greatest irony of all, if we are in fact now back into a zone of negotiations, the kind of deal that Trump is looking to create is a deal that looks like the Iran nuclear deal, which is the one that he just walked away from. So an extraordinary set of mistakes around foreign policy toward just one country. But I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the subject of today, human rights. This administration has failed on human rights in so many different ways. It started at the beginning when Rex Tillerson said he didn't want to talk about values. He wanted to talk about interests, without understanding that promoting human rights is a core interest of the United States as well as a core value. After all, this is a country founded on human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all persons are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Tillerson then did the absolutely baffling step of deciding that his prime goal should be to cut the budget of his own agency, which violates every rule of bureaucratic politics. He has not spoken out on human rights with China, Russia, Egypt, the Philippines, and most glaring is his lack of engagement on human rights with Russia and in the Middle East, particularly with Egypt, the Bahrain arms sale, congratulating Erdogan on irregular referendum, and then most glaring of all on Saudi Arabia. The plan was to eliminate democracy and human rights from the State Department's mission statement. I was Assistant Secretary for Democracy and Human Rights and Labor. That would have gutted my mandate. And then to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. I actually think this is something where it was better for us to leave voluntarily than to be voted off. Why? Because I think a subsequent president can then re-engage without having to go through the process of why were we voted off. And then John Bolton's attack on the International Criminal Court, where he said, I will arrest, or we will arrest, prosecutors and judges who come from the International Criminal Courts of the United States. Again, as a lawyer, you might well ask, under what possible legal authority? There is none. And then Jamal Khashoggi, really one of the low points one can imagine, where suddenly our president is credulous in the face of unanimous reports by his own intelligence agencies, where he will not himself trigger the Magnitsky Act, although it's triggered by members of Congress. And the extreme nature of this ought to become clear, that the North Koreans have now assassinated the brother of Kim Jong-un in Malaysia with chemical agents, that the Russians have assassinated someone in Salisbury, England, using nerve agents, that the Saudis have gone to a diplomatic facility and claiming that it was a spontaneous act to which they happened to bring a bone saw, send 12 to 15 people to carry out an execution within a diplomatic facility, and then to deny it, and then when finally caught out, to say that those people will be sacrificed. And let us not forget that in the United States, pipe bombs were placed into the mail, directed toward most of our presidential candidates and a number of presidential aspirants, as well as charitable figures. This is not normal, and this is an astonishing state of affairs that we will have to overcome as time moves on. If you put this together with global trends on human rights, the World Justice Index reports that the measure of human rights is down in 2/3 of 113 countries examined. Since 2016, the rule of law index has declined in 38. And we all have seen the rise of authoritarians in Poland, Hungary, Brazil, the Philippines, Turkey, Venezuela, Austria, Italy, China with the life service of Xi Jinping, and of course Putin. The new global authoritarians, of whom Trump is only one, and therefore a symptom as much as he is a cause, they all play by the same playbook. They demonize immigrants, they cow legislators, they disparage bureaucrats, they intimidate the judiciary, they reward their cronies, they attack the media, they claim that constitutional checks and balances must give way to the will of the people. Now, in many respects, Trump is a symptom of a rise of global forces that unleashed economic forces, technological shifts, killed jobs, froze wages, forced migration, enhanced inequality, and led to the middle class's belief that they were losing out, and left them feeling angry, abandoned, and betrayed. And they blamed globalism, immigration, diversity, inclusion. And so nationalist movements began again, and this was combined with the triple crises in Europe of refugees, regional destruction, and Brexit, perhaps maybe now about to be undone and stalled economic development. So at least part of the message has to be that these global analysis is false, that our relationship with globalism is not a zero-sum game, it's a positive-sum game, that immigrants can be part of the solution as well as part of the problem. If there's anything that the Lantos family proves, it's that immigrants are part of the solution. And that while globalization must be managed, it is possible and, in fact, more tolerant to promote solutions through diversity, inclusion, and multinationalism than it is to go in the opposite direction. What I argued in the book is that by and large, through what I call transnational legal process, the guardrails of democracy have largely held against Trump to this point. Not so well overseas. And so we are facing a global crisis now. I do think that with the election in November, this past November, the worm has turned. And we're looking at multiple threats to this administration, legislative. We see that Chief Justice Roberts resisting his impulses with regard to caricaturing judges. We see members of the executive branch turning against Trump, and in fact his own subordinates leaving in record numbers or being fired, and an extraordinary string of legal and criminal actions against members of the administration. Most recently, someone who basically said that he had acted under instructions of individual one to commit a felony. And we're in the early stages of this. Now, I have analogized this in my book to Muhammad Ali's rope-a-dope, that in the early going, people thought that Muhammad Ali was about to lose his fight. All he was doing was absorbing punishment and counter-punching. In the 7th round of that fight, while his opponent wildly flailed away, if you had asked who's winning, they would have said Ali's opponent. In fact, it was Ali himself who was about to prevail. I do believe that civil society, the traditions of human rights and justice, the networks of committed individuals are stronger than Donald Trump. One of my new favorite books is The Secret Life of Trees, which it talks about the resilience and resistance of organic systems to massive insults. Through it all, they survive. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves now in the weeks and months ahead are, who speaks for America? Is it Donald Trump and his tweets? Or is it the rest of us, our enduring civic institutions, our courts, our civil society, international organizations, our allies, Congress, the media, and our bureaucracy? I think that we all own these issues. We all own climate change. We all own human rights. We all own immigration. It's not just his. And that the resilience and resistance that has been shown thus far will continue and strengthen until finally one side starts to give way. And I think that that's starting to happen. Let me close with a joke that's in my book itself. It's the famous Mel Brooks line from The 2,000-Year-Old Man. The 2,000-year-old man is asked, before the Almighty, was there someone else? And he answers, yes, there was a guy named Phil. And they said, and what did Phil do? He said, well, we used to say to Phil, oh, don't kick us and don't hurt us and don't beat us. And then one day, lightning came out of the sky and struck Phil dead. And we said, there's something bigger than Phil. Well, in the same way, I'd say there's something bigger than Trump. That is the law, that's international law, and the many, many institutions that support it. And I think that on this Human Rights Day, it will be that constellation of forces that will carry the day against those forces that are trying to disrupt this environment to substitute for our Kantian system of global governance an Orwellian system, and I hope preserve the integrity of the international order that we have created. I'm delighted to be here. I'm happy to continue in conversation with my friends and to answer questions from all of you. But again, let me say what an honor it is to be here with Tom Lantos and his family.
Well, that was fantastic, as I knew it would be. And before we call up Dr. Elliot Cohen, who's going to join us for the conversation, I want to present to you, without lifting it, the prize or the award that we give to our lecturers. I don't know if it's been distracting some of you here, but you know, my father really did care about the whole world. And any of you who ever had the opportunity to visit him in his office, he had a huge map of the world on the wall that absolutely dominated everything else. And he used to tell me when I was a little girl, that his favorite book as a little boy was Around the World in 80 Days. So for him, there was nothing more wonderful than to contemplate this world and how he could make it better. And so we thought, Dr. Koh, that to remind you of your day today with us, that you might enjoy this globe, which circles based on, there's no battery, it runs off the energy provided by light. So it's a little bit of a perpetual motion thing.
I want to tell you that this is a MUVA.
Yes, it is.
I so admired them that I asked my family to get me one, and they got me the little one.
Oh!
Because they thought the big one was too
expensive. Well, okay, we won't draw any invidious comparisons between who loves you more, but you know, maybe the facts kind of speak for themselves. Well,
but now I have home and office.
Oh my
great.
gosh! Well, nothing could be more perfect. So. The good news is you don't have to carry it home with you today. The wonderful people here at Johns Hopkins are going to ship it to you. But I feel like we hit a home run. And so let me thank you again. Thank you. And if you can take a seat here.
Do I sit here or here?
I'm going to put you here in the middle, and I'm going to be here. And we'd like to now call up Dr. Elliot Cohen, who's going to be joining us. Dr. Cohen, if I may, I know you were going to make a few remarks about my father. Before you do that, I'd like to briefly read your resume, because we have another extraordinarily impressive and talented voice who is going to be part of this conversation. So if you'll give me a moment, I'll do that, and then I'm going to do my best to question these gentlemen. Elliot Cohen, who is seated right here, is the Robert E. Osgood Professor here at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He directs the Strategic Studies program, and I know you now have new duties as a dean, so he's sort of shifting a bit, but has been here at SAIS for
28 years.
For 28 years, which is quite extraordinary. From 1982 to 1985, back in his infancy, he was the assistant professor of government at Harvard and assistant dean at Harvard College. And in 1985, he became a member of the strategy department of the United States Naval War College. In February 1990, he joined the policy planning staff of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And in July of that year, he was appointed professor of strategic studies at SAIS. He has served as counselor of the Department of State, a principal officer of the department, where he had special responsibility for advising the Secretary on Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, and Russia, as well as general strategic issues. Reminds me of the joke that Madeleine Albright used to say when she was Secretary of State, that she really didn't have that many things on her list of things to do. The problem was everything was a continent. So, it's sort of that list reminds me a bit of that. He has represented the Department of State in interagency coordination with the senior National Security Council staff, Department of Defense, and the intelligence community. Dr. Cohen is also the author of an extraordinarily impressive list of books, and I'm just going to mention two of the more recent. The Big Stick, The Limits of Soft Power and the Necessity of Military Force, which was published in 2017. And this one sounds so fascinating. The title is Conquered into Liberty, 2 centuries of battles along the great warpath that made the American way of war, and that was published in 2011. And on a personal note, Dr. Cohen's very talented daughter, Rebecca, was an intern many years ago in my father's congressional office, and I found out today that she is a Navy JAG, and my youngest son recently commissioned as a Navy JAG, so we were sort of bonding on that shared experience. But Dr. Cohen, I know you wanted to say a few opening words, so.
Well, thank you. First, it's great to be up here with Professor Koh. The only thing is, it seems to me a little bit unjust. You have all your hair, even though you're a couple of years older than me. I am where I am. I wanted to say a few things about Tom Lantos, because I knew Congressman Lantos. He was a wonderful, urbane, erudite, and upright man, both in the physical sense. He had wonderful posture, but more importantly in the moral sense. And he radiated that. I would say, I want to touch on one thing in particular. He was, of course, a Holocaust survivor. And I think that, in my dealings with him, I think it colored his view of the world in 2 ways. First, or maybe 3 ways. First, you could smell when evil was coming our way. You know, I remember, this must have been like 15 years ago or so, when he began talking to me about Viktor Orban and the threats to freedom in Hungary, and he was prescient. Secondly, I think he understood in the way that that generation in general, but certainly anybody who had survived in the Europe of the 30s and 40s would, that really bad things can happen. I think understanding that not just that evil is out there, but evil can win, or at least can win in the short to medium term. And that's really important. I think with the passage of that generation, even those who didn't go through the horrors of what happened in Europe in those years, but those who experienced it even from here, we've lost something. And the third thing is, he understood in a visceral way that I think only an immigrant could, that the United States had an extraordinarily important role to play through upholding human rights, both by word but also by deed. And I think he would have subscribed to something that I heard Larry Summers, who was then president of Harvard, say when my oldest son took his commission as an officer in the United States Army in 2004, that you should always remember that we're strong because we're free, but we're also free because we're strong. And I think that's a sentiment that Tom Lantos would have agreed with. So I still miss him. It's been a decade. His voice is needed now more than ever, but it's wonderful to be up here, and it's wonderful that you're carrying on his great tradition. I also, by the way, should mention, several of his grandsons have come to SAIS, of course.
That's true.
And
That's
I've taught
true.
a few of them.
And a son-in-law, a grandson-in-law.
And a son-in-law. So, you know, and since it's a big family, keep on sending.
It is, it is. We do have a big family, you know. My sister and I, when we were quite young, my parents being survivors of the Holocaust, almost all of their families were wiped out, and we felt that, in a way, the best way to answer evil was with something good. And so kind of my sister, who's a few years older, really was the one who took the lead on this. But we felt we wanted to have big families. You can never replace the family taken from you, but to answer those who took our families. And so we did end up with big families. I have 7 children and my sister 10. And both my mother and father were only children. And so it was kind of astonishing to them that they should end up with 17 grandchildren. But after my father got over the shock of it, he decided it was absolutely wonderful. And he liked to brag about it, actually, quite a bit. And he rarely met colleagues who had as many grandchildren as he did. But when he occasionally came across somebody with as big of a posterity, if you will, he would get this very competitive little look in his eyes, and in his memorable Hungarian accent, he would pull out what he thought was his ace card, and he'd say, "Yes, you have 18 grandchildren, but from how many children?" And then he was rarely beaten, because usually the people with 18 or 19 grandchildren have 4 or 5 kids producing all those. Well, to launch our conversation, which I hope will be lively and will include some disagreements. So I intend to ask what I hope are challenging questions, but I wanted, actually, because we are here on a day when we remember the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I wanted to commend to all of you an absolutely fabulous book that tells the story of the drafting and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't know if our 2 distinguished participants have read this memorable little volume by Professor of Law from Harvard, Mary Ann Glendon, called A World Made New. But she tells this story almost like a novel. It's a page turner. You can't put it down, and the characters sort of come alive. And I will say that as I was preparing for my role, moderating a conversation between 2 such distinguished individuals, I felt a little bit the way that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote about how she felt the first time she convened some of these brilliant, brilliant minds who were gathering for the first time to talk about how they would begin this process of drafting this unprecedented document. She wrote the following in her journal, in her memoirs. She said, "They arrived in the middle of a Sunday afternoon, so we would have plenty of time to work. It was decided that Dr. Humphrey, who was a Canadian delegate, would prepare the preliminary draft. And as we settled down over the teacups, one of them made a remark with philosophical implications, and a heated discussion ensued. Dr. Chang was a pluralist and held forth in charming fashion on the proposition that there is more than one kind of ultimate reality. The Declaration, he said, should reflect more than simply Western ideas, and Dr. Humphrey would have to be eclectic in his approach." His remark, though addressed to Dr. Humphrey, was really directed at Dr. Malik, the Lebanese representative, from whom it drew a prompt retort, as he expounded at some length on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. Dr. Humphrey joined enthusiastically in the discussion, and I remember that at one point Dr. Chang suggested that the Secretariat might well spend a few months studying the fundamentals of Confucianism. But by that time, I could not follow them. So lofty had the conversation become. So I simply filled the teacups again and sat back to be entertained by the talk of these learned gentlemen. Well, I love the charming self-deprecation of that quote from Eleanor Roosevelt's memoirs, because although they were very learned gentlemen indeed, we know that she was hardly overwhelmed and did a masterful job of really managing this process and leading to this extraordinary outcome, a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that takes its place alongside the great documents of history, the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Men. But it sort of, as I say, seemed to resonate with me, because I certainly feel myself to be among distinguished men. But I hope you'll forgive me if I don't just fill your teacups. I'm going to throw some, I hope, challenging questions at you, and let's see where the dialogue goes. So Dr. Koh, in your book, you talk about one of the factors that is helping to slow and in some senses even derail some of the problematic initiatives of the current administration is something that you call bureaucratic stickiness, which is a fun phrase. But when I read that phrase, I thought of a criticism we hear a great deal now, usually from, one side of the political spectrum. But we hear talk of something sometimes called the deep state. And it is not said in a flattering way. The deep state seeming to refer to those who are unelected, have no real business trying to interfere with and derail the agenda of a popularly elected president. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what bureaucratic stickiness is. Is there such a thing as a deep state? And if so, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And obviously, Dr. Cohen, this is a a conversation, so.
When I first got to the State Department, someone pulled me to one side and said, you know, at the State Department, we hate political appointees, lawyers, and professors.
You were the trifecta.
In other words, you know, the career service exists and has its own values and goes on and will outlive whoever's going to be there as a temporary matter. Now, the positive thing about this, I think, is that everybody there took an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. They did not take an oath to serve any human being. And therefore, if they believe they're being ordered to do things that are inconsistent with the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, they don't obey. Or if they do, they sent a dissent channel cable. On the travel ban, 1,000 diplomats at the State Department filed a dissent channel cable in the very early going. And I think that there's deep, understandably, horror and resistance to a lot of the anti-human rights activities. Both intrinsic animosity and a sense that this is deeply destructive to our foreign policy. So much of our reputation abroad depends on whether people think the United States is doing the right thing. And if they don't think the United States is leading them in the right direction, they won't follow. And in my book, what I describe is that one of Trump's ploys has been what I would call resigning without leaving, that he essentially disempowers us within existing institutions. And then there we are, isolated and alone. You know, look at the United States at the COP, the Paris Climate Agreement now, or Trump at the G20. He's there, but he has no influence. And on the cover of my book, I was asked initially, do you want a big picture of Donald Trump's face? And I said, God, no. I'll have to look at it. You know, you look at your book for the rest of your life. And they said, what would you like instead? And I said, I'd like a picture of the Wizard of Oz, which is a little man with his face projected on big TV screens speaking to a group of people who are laughing at him, which turned out to be the United Nations General Assembly. And I think that's essentially what's happening. Now, I think this has many implications. First of all, bad ideas are headed off. Almost everybody who leaves the government these days, political appointees, talk about the things that they prevented Trump from doing. You know, Bob Woodward's book is all about people grabbing stuff off his desk so that he didn't sign it. But at a lower level, you have strategic leaking, which is demonstrating that he had the information before him. You know, the CIA's intelligence assessment on Khashoggi was on the street, saying that they knew that MBS had orchestrated this. And therefore, Trump had the information to say something different from what he said, but what he said was clearly a craven cave to these interests, the Saudi interests. You know, call it deep state, but you can't fire everybody. Now, by the way, when I was a political appointee twice, you know, there's resistance to what's happening from another direction as well. And that tends to be, I think, a stabilizing factor over time. Radical changes are less possible. Sometimes they're possible, for example, in the wake of September 11th. But I was asked recently, you know, suppose there was a major terrorist attack, would you say that we should defer to Trump? And I said, absolutely not. He's mishandled everything else he's done. Why would you expect him to handle a crisis better than? And we ought to hold his feet to the fire. And we will get signals from the bureaucracy. You know, when Trump did the travel ban, it turned out he had never checked with the Justice Department as to whether they would defend it. And when he checked, the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, quit rather than defend it. So I think that the deep state is another way of saying that the government of the United States is more than just who happens to be at the top. And, you know, tweets don't happen to be law or commands. And so there's a limit to their effectiveness.
So, Dr. Cohen, do you share the 2 cheers for the deep state, or any pushback?
So I guess a number of things. One of my students once said that we should make up a size sweatshirt which says, In the front, SICE, and in the back, Deep State U. Because the truth is, I know just on my own, for my own part, I've got the government thoroughly penetrated with alumni. I also, by the way, my version of the Deep State story from the State Department actually came to me at the end of my tenure as counselor of the department when the transition was underway for the Obama administration. And I forgive my language because it's just a direct quote. I asked one of the long-serving ambassadors, I said, so, I know what a transition is like from the point of view of a political appointee from the old, discredited, despised administration, looking forward to the new, fresh people who haven't screwed up yet. And I said, what is it like for you career people? So he looked at me sort of over his glasses and said, do you know what the iron law of transitions is? I said, no. He said, however much you hate the current bunch of bastards, you're going to hate the next bunch of bastards even more. So that's just sort of the mentality of the deep state there. I guess I do have a slightly different angle. I think we've been saved from really bad things by the incredible incompetence of this administration and of this president. If God help us if he had been Huey Long. And I think part of the underlying difference, which might be worth exploring a bit, is, Harold, not surprisingly, approaches this in terms of the law and the power of the law. My outlook is, as I've told people, a little bit more like the prophet Isaiah on a really bad day and Maximilian Robespierre. I think this is largely about character and personality, and those things ultimately dominate. So we've been lucky, I think, that he's grotesquely incompetent. What do I mean by that? They simply haven't filled positions in the bureaucracy. When they have filled them, because of the revulsion that many of us who had served in Republican administrations felt, and I helped organize and wrote one of the two letters from Republican national security experts denouncing then candidate Trump. So a lot of us took ourselves off the field, even the ones who wish they haven't been allowed back in. So when he has made appointments, they've been, to be brutal about it, a combination of careerists and second and third raters. So they haven't been able to do very much. So we've been saved in part by that. I think, though, we shouldn't be too complacent because what he has done, and you see bits and pieces of this in the military, I think you see it even more in the law enforcement world, where people who are responding to the same anger, resentments, grievances that his very substantial base has, feel a little bit more empowered to express that now and perhaps to act on it. And so I would not be complacent. No, I'm not accusing Professor Koh of being complacent, but I would not be complacent. I think, if this goes away in 2 years, if Robert Mueller delivers the grandfather of all indictments, maybe it all goes away. If he loses the next election, I think it goes away and some norms are restored. But I worry about norms that have been violated and perhaps permanently. We can't tell. I have great faith in the resilience of the United States. But I think that the things that protect us are undoubtedly the law and rule of law and that oath that both of us took, which is to support and defend the Constitution, not to obey a particular individual. But we should pay as much attention to the norms and as to the law.
Katrina, if I could just
Yes.
follow up. There's a pro and con of this chaos and incompetence. In that, for example, I went to a distant country, I won't say what it is, but there was our career deputy chief of mission. And I said, how's it going here? And he said, it's like the 1800s. The people in Washington don't even know what we're doing. We send cables in and we don't get responses. So on a day-to-day, we're able to run the policy much as it was before. And then when there's a high-level visit, they suddenly notice that whatever they've been saying is not fully reflected, then we have to make an adjustment. Which explains why a lot of the job of the bureaucracy has been keeping stuff away from the White House and their, sporadic attention span. The downside of it is that countries like China don't operate that way. As my friend Steve knows, there are high-level officials on the Chinese side who have been there for 25, 30 years doing nothing but focusing on America and moving up through the ranks. And they are very focused. When I met with the North Koreans, with Albright in Pyongyang in 2000, there were 3 or 4 people. And when Trump got off the plane in Singapore, there they were. And they're not like Donald Trump. They don't think they can just make this stuff up at the spur of the moment or do no preparation. They were prepared for these meetings. In fact, the Korea bureaucracy on North Korea was largely so demoralized, all these people left. Victor Cha didn't get confirmed. Jo Yoon quit. But I noticed that one of the few intelligent statements that I heard Tillerson make about policy was at the ASEAN summit in Manila. He's on the airplane and they asked him a question and he said something quite intelligent, how we should be negotiating with the North Koreans. And I suddenly realized he had been in the company of Song Kim, who was our ambassador to the Philippines, who had also been our ambassador to Seoul and also had worked on North Korea policy for years. And so in that moment, he got the benefit of bureaucratic guidance. So when Trump finally goes to Singapore, who's there prepping the meeting? Song Kim was pulled out to lead the delegation on that issue. So there is great expertise within the bureaucracy that has to be tapped because other people who don't wish the United States well are deploying their very single-minded institutional memory against us.
I think there are a lot of people, probably many, if not most of the people in this room, who have felt that the current administration, Donald Trump's presidency, poses somewhat unique threats to the norms and standards that we have become accustomed to. And some have expressed the concern that in an effort to thwart some of the ill-considered initiatives that this administration is trying to advance, we may be attempting to stretch certain laws and certain processes out of their normal shape in order to encompass activities that he's doing to thwart him and to stop him, and that it could be difficult to have those laws and those standards resume their normal shape. Let me give you a specific example of what I'm talking about. There's been a lot of discussion in the last couple of days that possibly the Mueller investigation is opening up the door to indictments related to campaign finance regulations. I realize this is a little outside the realm of our conversation about human rights. And yet, you have people saying, that could be problematic when we're past the Trump era, because if expenditures made to make a personal embarrassment and problem go away, if all expenditures made that could, for example, have any beneficial impact on a campaign become construed as campaign contributions requiring reporting, et cetera, if we expand our understanding of those campaign finance laws to sort of criminalize and encompass conduct that we find very unsavory in this instance, those things, it may be hard to unscramble that egg. During the early stages of sort of the Russia investigation, we got to a point where anybody who had any sort of meetings, even completely legitimate meetings with representatives of the Russian embassy, somehow seemed to fall under a degree of suspicion, even though that's to some degree what we want our government officials doing, is meeting. So the question I have for both of you is there a risk that in sort of the zeal of those who see the overthrowing of norms and standards and values to find ways to hold this administration legally accountable? Is there a risk that we stretch laws and stretch our standards of what becomes criminal or impeachable conduct to a shape that we may not want it to stay in, but it might be hard to resume its old shape?
So I tend to think that the legal obsession of one administration tends to be ignored in the next administration. I mean, remember emails? That it's wrong to use your personal emails. I mean, this is used as a threat to lock her up. And Ivanka Trump is doing the exact same thing. I'm not hearing that same legal obsession. It was a political weapon that was brought out for that particular moment and time. What I think is more troubling, I think we want to look behind the legal rules to their broader purpose. So for example, take the case of emoluments, which people are talking about. And obviously emoluments has a lot to do, there's an emoluments clause and a foreign emoluments clause, and it's supposed to make Congress be involved when someone takes gifts or things of value. People act like the only issue is Trump's and his family's private greed. The real issue is foreign policy. I mean, why would the Saudis ever go to our ambassador in Saudi Arabia to have a meeting and have a cable sent through the front channel to the Secretary of State if they can go to the Trump Hotel, sit in the bar, and meet a member of the family and propose some idea, and then suddenly 500 hotel rooms are rented? That's completely outside the scope of oversight, and it creates a second channel of diplomacy, which trivializes the first channel. And I think people are focusing on emoluments, and then they say, this is a technical kind of violation, but it very fundamentally goes to the notion as to whether we have a foreign policy that's capable of congressional oversight.
Again, a somewhat different view. I'd push back a little bit on the idea that we're dealing with circumstances that were completely unforeseen or unforeseeable. So my equivalent of the let's start a legal clinic story the day after the election. I was also teaching the day after the election, and I was supposed to do something in World War II, and the student said, "You got to say something about the election." And so I spoke for about 15 minutes, and then at the end I said, remember the famous story at the end of the Constitutional Convention, which had met in secret. Old Benjamin Franklin leaves. He's in a carriage, and the crowd, who don't know what the Constitution's going to have in it, say, "What kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" And he famously replies, "A republic, if you can keep it." And I think if you study what that generation had lived through, they were very aware of the possibility of demagogues and all that. So it's not as if it's completely unanticipated. And even things like money shaping foreign policy. I mean, it was actually the other way around early in the Republic when Talleyrand was soliciting bribes. So that's not unprecedented. I think you're putting your finger on something that's real, which is the stretching of norms. But I tend to think that there's a broader context there, which is that both parties, and I'm very glad I'm back to where I ought to have been, which is an independent, have been doing things over the last 30 or 40 years where there's a kind of striving for partisan advantage, which doesn't leave a whole lot of room for the Tom Lantoses of this world, who is quite a brilliant centrist in many ways. So I think, for example, of the attitudes towards special prosecutors. And I vividly remember what friends of mine in the Democratic Party had to say about special prosecutors during the Clinton administration. And I know what Republicans say about special prosecutors just now. You find very few people who somehow can cross the party line on that. Or I think about attitudes towards the use of executive orders rather than trying to get legislation through a somewhat hostile Congress. And, Republicans outraged when Obama does it, and vice versa. So I think there are some deeper kind of structural problems in democratic governance now. But then again, I have a great belief. I'm a short-term pessimist about most things, but I have a long-term confidence in the resilience of the United States and the genius of the constitutional system that we have for the ship to right itself. I've been telling people, I've been just finished reading Richard White's wonderful volume in the Oxford History of the United States called The Republic for Which It Stands, which is basically about Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. And if you really want to get distressed about the state of American politics, read that. I mean, it's appalling what happened in the 1870s and 1880s. We somehow sorted through that, and I think we'll sort through this as well.
Look, you alluded to this in your remarks, Dr. Koh. What we're experiencing in the United States is not isolated. Donald Trump fits in a larger context of somewhat anti-democratic leaders moving their countries in the direction of illiberal democracy, rising populism, fueled by many of the same anxieties from country to country, and a growing suspicion of elites, a growing sense of betrayal on the part of, what we might call, sort of the forgotten men and women, as this administration likes to refer to them. What do you both see as the sources of this rising populism, this, bitter anger? I mean, we see what's happening in the streets of Paris right now, which is not an insignificant threat. And what do you see as the potential solutions? And after that question, I do want to give an opportunity for some questions from the audience. But if you could each perhaps make some comments about the broader context of rising populism, rising illiberal leadership in democratic contexts.
I think we see a middle class, a global middle class that has, whose lot has not improved, and they're looking for somebody to blame. And you might as well blame immigrants, or you might as well blame globalism for what's making life more difficult. I think the problem is nobody's telling really the other side of the story. People ask me all the time, why does international law matter? If you did a Jimmy Stewart, it's Christmas time, what a wonderful life. When I was a kid, to go to Europe, you had to separately negotiate your passport at every single country. We didn't have protocols that allowed our baggage to be protected on the way over. So if you lost your bags, you were out of luck. We couldn't go to an ATM machine and withdraw money under the SWIFT protocol that allows it. We couldn't communicate through telecommunications protocols to let our parents know where we were. We had to go and, pick up a letter from the American Express office. All of these things are the product of globalization. So globalization has to be managed, and some changes will occur. And, so people think, coal is coming back. Obviously this is crazy. Who's saying that it is because we're slaves of fossil fuel that our leaders are kowtowing to MBS and his ilk? These people just happen to be sitting on pools of oil, can forget about human rights and democracy, and claim fealty from the people who think they need their oil. And that's, I think, a great tragedy. I think the challenge, which I try to put into my book, is that for 70 years, we've lived in what I call the system of Kantian global governance, based on Kant's to perpetual peace, which is not describing a world government, but a law-governed international society of democratic nations trying to live up to its collective beliefs. And in that environment, by and large, foreign policy was not contested between the two parties. When you look at George H.W. Bush's funeral, not many people would have handled Tiananmen Square or the fall of the Berlin Wall differently from, on the Democratic side, differently from George H.W. Bush. They supported him. But now, every issue is contested, including even human rights and democracy itself, democracy promotion as political footballs. When Elliot refers to Tom Lantos' bipartisan power, he was able to find a sponsor on issues like torture or trafficking or across the aisle. And now increasingly these things, religious freedom was actually a bipartisan issue as opposed to something which is, veiled protection for one religion while another religion is being demonized.
So I guess here I'll give a somewhat different answer, although not that I disagree with everything that Professor Koh said. But the fact is that neither of us worries, one might say without reason, but it doesn't make a difference. Neither of us worries about losing our job to somebody who's an illegal immigrant. None of us worries about losing our job to a self-driving truck. Okay? Neither of us is uncomfortable with rapidly changing social norms. That's not true of a lot of people. And I think that's important that we recognize that. I also feel, and I've felt this quite strongly for some time, that we have a tendency, again, people like us, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Yale, to think of this as a problem as those people out there and what's wrong with them. And we do that either contemptuously or with some degree of pity. I think we'd be better off if we said, what's the problem with us? Because we are the elites, unambiguously. Elite in every possible way that you can imagine. And my belief is that elites maintain their legitimacy in three ways. I mean, elites are just a fact of political and social life. They maintain them by contributing value to the society, whether it's in terms of economic productivity or international success. They maintain legitimacy by displaying virtues that people admire, whether it's of public service or heroism in war, which kept aristocracies going for quite a long time, and when they're open to new talent. And I think if you look at elites in the Western world, they fail all three tests. Particularly after 2008, you look at some of these characters making obscene salaries whose companies are ruined and other people get thrown out of work. Really, what's the value that they're contributing? Virtue? Don't get me started. There's no conspicuous display of virtue of any kind that I would recognize. And perhaps through no fault of our own, it's actually getting harder to penetrate the elites. Because what happens is people go to the Harvards and Yales and the Johns Hopkins and they meet each other and they have kids and they give those kids every possible advantage, naturally, starting in kindergarten, and do everything they can to groom them to go to elite institutions. And guess what? They meet each other, marry, and they have more kids who then get the same goodies. And there is a real problem, I think, that is unrecognized. Well, it's recognized, but people don't want to really address it squarely, of social mobility. This is a very different country than the one that, say, my grandfather came to as an immigrant with really no education, started as a cutter in a shoe factory and ended up owning the factory, and then had a son who went to Harvard, a son and grandchildren went to Harvard. That's not the world that we're in now, and I think it would behoove those of us who've benefited from this system to think about how we got here and really what others think and should think of us.
Well, I would lodge a little bit of a dissent to that. I teach students, many of whom are from first-generation professional families or whose parents were immigrants and came to this country with nothing. Tom Lantos and Annette Lantos are immigrants, and they became a member of Congress. And My father father and mother were immigrants. I became dean of a great law school in one generation. Now, I think the question now is the attitude of these people who have been, Barack Obama's father left his family, and he's from Kenya, and Barack Obama had no possibility to be president of the United States if you looked at the demographic, right? Anyway, he won twice. I do believe there's a kind of openness that still makes it possible for people to achieve extraordinary things. Now, that doesn't mean that other parts of the elite don't do everything that Elliot describes. I think the question then is this diversity, this inclusion, this globalism somehow the enemy? Or is it what makes America special? This is one of the very few countries in the world where very diverse groups of people coexist. And we're big fans of the Boston Red Sox, and my son said the first time we went to the park, I love the Red Sox because it's the only place I've seen where 6'3" blonde guys wear shirts that say Ortiz or Matsuzaka. It's an amazing state of affairs. Or that it's so open on so many levels. You have kimchi in your taco, or you have Gangnam Style being played at bar mitzvahs. There's a sort of borrowing from other cultures and a rejoicing in diversity, and that I think is very special. And I don't think, are the elites doing a great job? Many are not. But I also think we have to recognize why America still, in the eyes of the world, is a very special place.
No, and I should say, I agree with that. And I agree, we'll find ways through that. And there'll be the Mike Bloombergs who are going to make sure that anybody can get a Johns Hopkins education, no matter where they come from, what their income level is. And I agree. This is why I am a long-term optimist about the United States, for exactly the reasons that Professor Koh mentions. But, the facts are the facts. And, this is documented in all kinds of studies of undergraduates and even to some extent graduate students at elite institutions. The system has been getting more ossified and blocked. And we just need to be aware of that. And there are all kinds of ways that it can be tackled. But we shouldn't think that it's not on the members of the elite to do something about that. And again, God bless him, Mike Bloomberg is a great example of somebody who's decided he is going to do something about that, at least with one particular institution.
I want to save time for a few questions. Yes, this gentleman here.
So my question is about the relationship between laws and norms. Oh. Thank you. So thank you for the talk. My question is about the relationship between laws and norms. So assuming for a moment that legal interpretations change over time, and as Professor Cohen said, norms are changing, if not in a permanent way, at least in a noticeable way, do you expect legal interpretations and legal frameworks to change as well? Or do you think norms change at a faster and perhaps more durable rate than legal frameworks do?
I would just say they can go in opposite directions. So if you look at the 1850s, particularly in the North, the norm against slavery really shot way up. Slavery didn't exist in northern states, but you had the fugitive slave laws and so on. The law was Dred Scott. The law was going in one direction, and norms were going in a different direction. In the long run, the norms won. And I would just remind everybody that Tocqueville, who was the most profound student of the United States ever, said it's the norms as much as, and perhaps more than the laws, that keep the United States free.
Well, I think, political scientists tend to talk more about norms, and lawyers talk more about law. Regime theory talks about rules, processes, and decision-making, norms and decision-making procedures that govern particular issue areas. And often they're talking about law, but they don't use the L word. Now, I think, when things are put into law, they're harder to change. And they tend to define conduct. In the same way that when you put up a contractor puts up the walls of your house, they could be destroyed, but they tend to reroute behavior. And so I think that the relationship, one of the great, I think, quite insightful things that are going on a lot of blogs, the Just Security blog has something called Norms Watch, which is a description of some of the norms that Trump has violated. One of the earliest ones is he doesn't put out his tax returns, right? I mean, this is a shocking state of affairs. On the other hand, there's no law that requires it. And then the question is, why isn't it required by law? So I think it's a lot easier for someone to come in or in an emergency situation, claimed emergency situation, to shift norms by claiming that those norms apply to a different state of affairs and that we're looking at changed circumstances. And that's, or in the case of Trump, he argues that everyone was duped and they didn't realize that the norms that they were adhering to were, quote, bad deals. But I really want to emphasize, if there's something that Trump just literally doesn't understand, the world is not about deals. It's about relationships. And he's terrible with relationships, as you can tell. And he sees the world in these sort of zero-sum terms. When he talks about a bilateral trade deficit, who knows how many different countries participated in the elements that went into this globe? I don't know. But are we going to evaluate that according to a bilateral trade deficit? Suppose there were 12 different countries' components and it was assembled in a 13th. Why talk about the bilateral trade deficit? It's a product of a global economy.
Thanks.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Oh, hi. Vanessa Neumann. I have a brief observation and a question. I'm a Latin Americanist, so rule of law, anti-corruption. I do a lot of illicit trade. There's a bit of an issue. My comment about the 2008 and the deep state, I want to push the issue a bit. It's not just that people are afraid of globalism. I think it's also the elites failed. I mean, the people who were supposed to be in charge clearly didn't know what they were doing, or a lot of 2008 would not have happened. And I think that's the feeling that you're getting, that there's still a lot of anger, that there were all these PhDs that should have stopped the banking crisis or the losses of the houses, and that the game was rigged, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we need to understand that dynamic, we need to take that anger seriously and what's out there. Otherwise, we're not going to get there. My question is about how do you... Latin America is a continent of great promise, right? It should be like all the minerals, it has all one language, and it hasn't kept that promise because of corruption. Rule of law has failed, and now you see, Bolsonaro's election, AMLO's election, they're both opposite sides of parallels to Trump. How do we get out of this? You mentioned laws have an edifying, when done right, can have an edifying role in the body politic. Right? If it's illegal, you can teach people that it's wrong and to modify their behavior. But you get into a chicken and egg issue. So what would you advise AMLO on anti-corruption, I suppose is one way to put it?
Well, I think the rise of anti-corruption consciousness in Latin America is a very positive thing. The Odebrecht and the real question is what can be done in a concerted way to attack this and clean up the government. I think if people don't have confidence in their government, then they rely on other mechanisms, and those mechanisms tend not to be transparent or overseeable or open to democratic processes. I think the challenge now is will the newest group of people who've been elected be able to walk a line that, we had a swing back with people like, Maduro, and those who insisted on using their popular support to, there's a story yesterday about how the Venezuelans no longer are listening to Maduro's populist rhetoric because it's being used to adjust checks and balances and to, diminish faith in democratic institutions. So the real challenge in these countries, I think, is to strengthen democratic institutions. And, Mexico has only recently moved to a two-party system, really. Colombia, just remember, it was a place where the Supreme Court was bombed, not so long ago. And what could be a clearer example than Peru, where, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was a well-known economist who people thought, oh, he's an intellectual, he's not going to be corrupt. Anyway, it turns out that this is not the case. So we have this, the real challenge for all of us, every country, is how to elect a government that's as good as the people. This was one of the slogans of Jimmy Carter, which was much derided. But it's really true that all of the efforts to sort of clean this up have gone by the wayside. Campaign finance control and other kinds of things. McCain-Feingold. These were very important efforts, now displaced by things like Citizens United, and now very massive abuse of all these questions about how can you actually gain access to a democratic process if you're not a billionaire, where people who both have media recognition and huge amounts of money can suddenly aspire to be president of the United States. Michael Avenatti suddenly just says he's running for president, because he's on TV. It's just a shocking state of affairs.
Dr. Cohen, thoughts on that?
I
We'll pass
think
on that
I'll,
one. I think this will have to be our last question because we're coming to the end, so this will be our final question.
There's been a lot of doom and gloom, so I'm going to try to flip it a little bit. I am very much like Dr. Cohen. I'm a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist. I think we are living through a fascinating time, and legally there's some very interesting things happening. The rise of state rights and states getting involved in legal human rights issues and legal constraints against the presidency. We have some very interesting lawsuits of countries suing multinational corporations related to climate change, students who are rising and speaking out. And I want to talk about some of the positive second and third order effects that are going to be coming out of this. I think one of the things that you have not addressed is the fact that there's been the rise of the centralization of power in the presidency, and that happened long before this current president. And what are the second and third order effects after this administration? What are the positive second and third order effects? Thanks.
Well, I think it remains to be seen. You have to remember that after Watergate in Vietnam, you had a rise of legislation and a set of framework statutes that reinserted Congress into decision-making on a whole set of issues. The War Powers Resolution, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Essentially a kind of National Security Administrative Procedure Act. And while that hit bumps in the road at various points along the way, the Iran-Contra affair, et cetera, the whole idea was supposed to be that Congress is actually discharging its constitutional obligations through these framework statutes, and all of them are, 40, 50 years old now. And the real question is, if you don't like presidential power and the concentration of presidential power, Congress has to legislate. And I take it as a very good sign, this statement about the war in Yemen. They've completely abdicated their power over war making. And so because they're not ready to take a vote on something that can be held against them, which is a war making vote. So I think the answer to your question is, will people recognize that the Trump time was something that shouldn't be repeated? It was deeply aberrational, but the solution is not to just assume other people will come and make it better. They have to fix the system and the interactive system of shared power.
And I guess I'm optimistic for a number of reasons, but one of them is, and you certainly saw this in the last election, there's just an enormous amount of political energy out there. And some of it I think is cracked, and some of it is even possibly dangerous, but a lot of it is really very wholesome. You have all kinds of people engaging in political activity who didn't get engaged before at all the different levels of government. And I think that's a very welcome sign. I also think, I may have started as a political scientist, but I'm basically an historian now. You know, I think a sense of perspective helps. So the other thing I said to my students the day after the election was, you know, my parents lived through the Great Depression and World War II and McCarthy and the Korean War and the civil rights struggles and Vietnam. And my grandparents lived through all that and pogroms, World War I, and the great influenza epidemic. So who says we have it easy? and I think we sometimes underestimate just how resilient we can be if we just show a little spine. And I think there are plenty of people with spine out there. And so we'll get through this. I mean, I honestly, this is a separate conversation, but there's no doubt in my mind that we'll get through this okay. I worry about the damage to the international system that we will observe when we stick our heads over the parapets in a few years and see what's transpired since then. But that's a separate conversation here at SAIS.
But can I just say, I think 2016 election was a wake-up call for a lot of people, but particularly for the young people, the students.
Yep.
You know, who had been living in an environment where they felt that they could not vote and it didn't matter. You know, and Brexit was a good example of people, the people who just taken being part of the EU for granted, just assuming the vote would go that way and not going to the polls. And I think that what Elliot is describing as this energy is a real recommitment that this democracy is our democracy to win or lose. You know, when you say a republic, if you can keep it, it means every single person. You know, this last election, my wife and I went out to 3 or 4 different polling stations for different candidates. My daughter worked for 8 different candidates on, you know, as her side, you know, in addition to her day job. And it's that level of commitment that we're going to need, you know, which I think then exposes everybody to the challenges of direct democracy. And, you know, it starts with our students.
Well, that is an optimistic note on which to end. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking these 2 extraordinary intellects for a fascinating conversation, and Professor Harper will bid us farewell.
I would like to thank the Lantos Foundation and our panelists for our excellent panel this evening. And just to make 1 or 2 remarks of my own on this topic. To conclude briefly, I had the opportunity in 1974, for my first sabbatical as an academic, to go to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Geneva at the time that the Helsinki Final Act was being negotiated. And I interviewed actually all of the negotiators from all of the countries of Europe and North America who participated in that negotiation, which led to the signing of the Helsinki Final Act in the summer of 1975. And the most interesting aspect of that negotiation, of course, was the difficult process of including among the Decalogue, the 10 principles that underlie the Helsinki process, a provision about human rights, which was signed again in 1975 by the Soviet Union and all of the communist countries of Eastern Europe except for Albania. Now, most of the leaders at that time were rather cynical about this whole thing, I think, and probably thought they could get away without paying any attention to the human rights principles of Helsinki. But groups like Solidarity in Poland, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, and so forth, kept bringing the human rights issue up within their regimes, within the very strongly authoritarian regimes of the time. And I would remark today also on noting the death this past weekend of Lyudmila Alexeyeva, who founded in 1976 the Moscow Helsinki group, and for more than 40 years became a strong advocate of human rights within the Soviet Union and then again within Russia. And all of this reminds me then again of the importance of norms and laws and everything that combines the two. The principles of rule of law and human rights are probably the strongest methods we have of resisting the pressures of authoritarianism. And as we see authoritarianism growing again on many parts of the world and even to some degree in our own country, I think the work that your foundation is doing and that our panelists are doing to reinforce the importance of the rule of law and human rights as an underpinning of democratic governance is really essential and is the best method that we have at this time to resist authoritarianism whenever it shows its ugly head around the world. So again, I would like to thank our panelists and the foundation very much for their sponsoring this program, and we look forward to many more years of cooperation between SAIS and the Lantos Foundation. And in conclusion, I would like to invite everyone in the audience to a reception which will be held in the Herder Room immediately behind us here, and have a chance to meet informally with the members of our panel. And again, thank you all very, very much.